Welcome to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, hello and welcome once again to On the Mark. This is Peter Buckley, your host. I want to welcome our guest, as always, Mark O'Donnell. Mark, welcome. And a few days after 4th of July here, but a belated happy 4th of July.
Thank you. No, it's great. It's great to be back. It's great to have the 4th and have a little time off.
Indeed.
Real estate never stops.
Yeah. Even though we're talking about the 4th of July, I did want to mention something not necessarily as patriotic, but a book written by a Spanish gentleman. I was listening to a meditation from a priest of Opus Dei the other day, and he referenced a book by a woman. This woman's name is Marian Rojas Estape. And I think the title, he wasn't quite sure on it either, but it was something to the effect of how to make good things happen. Kind of, I think, a fairly generic kind of, self-help kind of thing, or not self-help, but, some, constructive book on self-improvement. And what he then mentioned was, I guess he knew of this woman's father, who was a professor of psychology and apparently a pretty well-known writer from Spain. In the meditation I was listening to, he was commenting on one of the father's writings and his reference to the Talmud, where there was this focus on 4 principles. And I thought it might be helpful for us to share the thoughts from this priest. Again, is based on this writing from this Spanish psychologist, and apply it to, people in the workforce, people in the workplace. So the first thing is, he said, the strong man is the man who is able to govern his passions. So we have the strong man. The rich man is the one who is content with what he has. The wise man is he who learns from all with love. And the honorable man is the one who treats everyone with due dignity. So maybe we can just, in the few minutes we have here, Mark, comment on each of these. So the first one, the strong man, is the man who is able to govern his passions. And so you say, all right, well, what are some of the passions we see exhibited in ourselves and certainly in others as we move along, the career path? I guess the obvious one in a professional context is greed, and this, willingness, where you see a lot of people willing to work really hard and logging, really significant hours for what? In an effort to just accumulate more money and climb kind of this ladder of promotions. And so what's wrong with this?
Well, I think the main thing that's wrong is that it doesn't recognize the fact that we're spiritual beings, that we're transcendent beings. And so once you take out the spiritual or the transcendent, in other words, you take out God, all you have is the material. So then you get this idolatry that forms, right, in the workplace. I just finished reading the Walter Isaacson book on Elon Musk, and a good part of the book is that Elon Musk is just always working, and he has this phrase that you have to go hardcore, or you have to go all in. And that means you have to be here all the time and work all the time. And it just destroys you. It ruins you. And I know that from experience. When I was working at Allied Signal, we had a hard charging CEO, young guy in his 40s, wanted to leave his mark. And he created so much stress in the environment that at one of the sales meetings or company meetings, he talked about, we're not going to make our numbers, and so there may be a layoff. And I'm not saying you're a bad person, bloody, 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 but you got to get your act together. And so after that meeting, a huge number of people went to HR and they actually asked to be laid off. And so this news got down to corporate in New Jersey, and they realized they had a major problem, because if 30% of your workforce wants to get laid off, right, because they don't like working there, your whole business could implode. So what they did right then is they fired this guy and they brought in a guy who was completely different. He was kind of, very not touchy-feely, but just much more humane and much more down to earth. And that kind of calmed the ship for a little bit, right? Um, but I'm telling you, there were, that that's what happens. And so when you're in that environment, it's hard to say govern your passions, right? Because you're just like, I got to get what I can get, and I also have to, you suffer anxiety,
Hmm.
sleepless nights. A lot of people are on medication. I mean, when I took the job, the head of the HR woman that hired me, she said, okay, we want to offer you the job. All right. We want you to be manager of strategic planning. You're going to focus on the brake business. And I said, this is great. I'm so excited. And she says, well, before you get too excited,
Hmm.
okay, this is, manager of it. She says, before you get too excited, I just want you to know that this is a really stressful place to work.
Hmm.
And I want you to meet, Steve, the CEO, before you make a final decision, just because you just need to do that. And I'm
And
like,
that
oh,
was
sure.
the in-house HR,
Yeah,
not a
in-house.
yeah. Yeah.
And she eventually quit because she came back from vacation uh, one year and she came into my office. Her name is Helen, and we were talking. And I said, how you doing? And she said, I was on vacation with my husband and I was nervous about work. And he just looks at me and he says, you're quitting. And I said, okay. And I am.
Hmm.
She said, I was getting heart palpitations on vacation because I had to take care of things. And I understand that, you want to be productive, right? But the problem is, you push people so hard that you just dehumanize them, and so we've created these environments that are awful places to work. And if you're in them for too long, they can just dehumanize you. So I think that that's a real problem in society today. And it's all kind of started with, hey, look, God doesn't exist. There's no transcendent reality. It's just here on earth, us here on earth. It's all materialism. We just have to push the envelope, work. We have to be all in and work, and whatever your goal is. You want to go to Mars, you want to build the best, smartphone. It doesn't matter what your goal is. If it's just strictly material, it needs to be balanced.
So maybe that's the answer to this next thought here. I mean, another passion. So we talked about greed, but there's another passion. I guess it's almost a corollary of it in a sense, and that is this tendency, which you just referenced yourself, to this despair, despondency, and I guess the antidote to that is fortitude is needed, right? I mean, so I think in your own life and in mine as well. I mean, the path to career success is not this uninterrupted linear progression upward where you have to deal with setbacks and demotions and relocations. So other than just, sucking it up and gutting it out, I mean, how do we keep this passion of despair in check?
Well, obviously, we have to realize that God loves us. And it sounds trite, right? But it's a reality, and that we're worth more than all of the material universe combined. One person, one soul is worth more than all of that. So what I would do is I would meditate like on Luke 12, where Jesus talks about this. He talks about the rich fool, that parable. I mean, to me, that's kind of the American paradigm. Is that, hey, you're successful, and now we have to tear down, tear this down and build something bigger. I mean,
Yeah.
we're just completely focused on.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, I'm not trying to allude to what you're doing at your house right now. I mean, that's not. But it's these kinds of things that will drive people, and they're driven because they're insecure, and they're insecure because they don't realize that they are children of God, creating His image and likeness. And I mean, this is one of the things that Saint Josemaria used to say. He would say, if someone's unaware of that fact that they're a child of God, then they're unaware of the most basic reality of their life.
Yeah.
And so many people we're working with, they're unaware of that. Now they could become aware of that. Yeah, if you're there and I'm there, And so we have to wade into these environments. We have to work with people, and they have to see how we practice detachment, how we govern our anxiety, you know, and they have to see that, and we do that primarily through prayer and the sacraments.
Yeah, so I mean, the greed and this sense of despair, despondency is not great, but not all passion is bad. And you might see maybe it's more embodied in younger workers, not yet cheated, less skeptical, and they really will demonstrate moments of great enthusiasm and excitement. It's important for, guys like us, experienced colleagues or maybe bosses, not to, stifle this enthusiasm to help them. I guess the way to do that is to help them be aware of the greater plan and the broader mission of what they're engaged in. So what's the best way to do that?
I mean, I really think it's our example, it's our sense of where is work located in the whole hierarchy of our values and time. I mean, there's a friend of mine who was at a company meeting, and someone asked a question about work-life balance, and another employee, I think it might have been the CFO, said, well, it's pretty simple. I just tell my wife it's all work, and if there's anything left over, then we'll do something. And so that works really well for me. And that's the kind of the crazy paradigm. So what you need to do is to get people in positions, in these companies that have balanced lives. Give you an example. When I was at General Cinema, my boss would actually go home for lunch every day. We worked in Newton, Chestnut Hill, and he lived in Wellesley, but he would actually drive home. And I remember people coming by my office saying, where's Jim? I said, well, I think he's at lunch. Lunch? Yeah, he goes home for lunch. And it was just such a great example of detachment that this guy, he wasn't going to ruin his personal life for whatever reason. I mean, that's simple, but it's meaningful. Now people don't even take lunch after, they don't go anywhere for lunch. I mean, they just work right through, a lot of people. And so I think you have to have create a balanced schedule, create it, and then just stop. Remember, you were talking about the idea that you just have to stop work at a certain time.
Yeah.
And, go home.
That's the great simple advice of Father Raphael Camano. And he said 3 things you have to deal with: get up on time, go to bed on time, and then he said the most difficult is leave work on time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the rich man here. So again, as this priest referenced in his meditation, the rich man is the one who's content with what he has. So that's in a letter to his letter to the Philippians. St. Paul tells us about his own life that he's learned to be content with, in whatever circumstance he's in. He said he knows what it is to be in need. He knows what it is to have plenty. He learned the secret to being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then he, kind of concludes by saying, I can do all things in him who can give me strength. So I want to look at that a little bit. I mean, being content with what we have, can't that lead to complacency and stifle ambition? And we do want to have some sense of, professional ambition. Is there a balance that can be struck between contentment and ambition? And what does this say to someone who feels they might be in a career rut, but has created, pretty good situation for themselves, kind of, stability at home, maybe some level of prosperity for the family? And what does it say to someone who could advance themselves professionally, maybe by relocating, taking them again from a, comfortable, fulfilling living situation? And maybe just a final thing to consider, what does it say to couples contemplating whether both spouses should work? There's a lot there, but I mean, the whole sense here is, again, we're going from the first thought being here, the rich man is one being content with what he has. Well, what does that say about our whole sense of motivation and ambition?
Well, I think you have to you have to start with the basic premise, Peter, and that is, do I want to grow interiorly? Do I want to grow in my relationship with God? And if I do, then how do I do that? And what I have to do is I need an interior spiritual workout plan, just like I do with my body. If you want to run a mile in under 6 minutes, you have to eat a good diet. You have to start running regularly. People know that. They know that. But what they don't realize is that in order to build a deep relationship with Christ, you have to do something similar. And that's what St. Paul is talking about, that he's able to pivot and adjust to any situation because he's denied himself, interiorly in the sense that he's made time for God. Let's put it that way. A lot of people I talk to, and I tell them I do an hour of mental prayer a day. They look at me like, "Are you nuts? How do you find time to do that? I can't even do 10 minutes." And I'm like, that's where you start. You're not going to do an hour a day, obviously, to start, right? But you have to put a line, draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going to do, 15 minutes in the morning and 15 in the evening. And I'm going to stick to it, just like I stick to my diet or whatever it is that you're really anxious, you really desirous of. And that's the act of faith. Okay, I'm going to take God at His word. I'm going to read the gospel, and I'm going to take Him at His word. And I'm going to, I'm not going to be anxious about all the stuff because He tells me not to be anxious. But then when you start to build that interior life, that you grow as a spiritual person, you become a better listener, a better lover, a better friend, a better spouse. That's how you do that. And so then people realize this person's fun to be with. This person actually loves me.
Yeah, you've worked with all kinds of people, and maybe what the priest was getting at in this meditation, this whole idea of being, the richness, being content with what you have. Maybe he's implying we should be grateful for the gifts and talents that we've been given, and not really, coveting the gifts and talents of others. Maybe speak to that in the context of the whole spectrum of, the types of people that you've worked with.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. I mean, basically, God gives us all different talents. We want to develop them. I mean, we all have a lot of ambition. When you and I were in our 20s, we wanted to, knock the ball out of the park, right? We wanted to kind of go out and do really well professionally. The world was our oyster, and we wanted to, climb the corporate ladder. And over time, by investing in our spiritual lives as well as in our material lives, we started to realize, okay, we need a balance here, and the material is not the be all and end all. And right now, it is the be all and end all for most people. So the way to change that is to get a job, which you have and I have, and most people listening to this have, but be aware of your colleagues and start to pray for your colleagues. And do your work in a more disinterested way, offer it to God. You'll be better at it. You'll do a better job. You'll probably get promoted. And people will see that. And then they're going to want to work with you. They're going to want to be on your team.
Yeah, maybe that's the real measure of wealth.
That's what you have to do.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was at Allied Signal, once I realized the business was going south, I got out of strategy, went into sales, just because I said, look, we got to shore up this thing. It's, we're not doing well. And so I was manager of sales operations, and I had like 110 sales guys I was working with. So I managed their compensation plan, their cars, their computers, all that stuff, right? And, they were really a hostile bunch at the beginning because there's a lot of pressure to produce. And so they call me and leave these nasty voicemails and all this other sort of shit, about, I need $600. It was supposed to be in my check last time. I never got it. And you better find this out, blah, blah, blah. And I simply just started saying, let me look into it. Let me do it. And then I get back to him and said, hey, I didn't find out anything, but I'm going to keep looking at it. And they totally changed. And then they started to say, wow, you mean you're helping me? Not, they didn't say it, but they acted that way. And then they just talked to each other. Then they said, call Mark. He'll figure it out. Call Mark. And I became like their go-to guy.
Mm.
And it just took a lot of the, not a lot, but some of the stress out of the situation because they knew, if they asked me to look for something for them, I'd find it. And I'd find out what the problem was. And so And I think I won them over that way, so they felt more comfortable, to the point where one of the guys came up to me at an offsite and said, "Look, you should be CEO. You got to be CEO." Of course, he was feeling pressure because he wasn't maybe making his numbers, but that's not something that I take credit for. What I do take credit for is looking out at the people and trying to you have a spiritual influence or a Christian viewpoint of them, and let's get the job done together and not worry about who gets the credit. You've heard that trite phrase before, but
No,
we're
I mean, that's
all
an
going to get
important,
credit.
it's an important point, and actually a wise one, and it transitions nicely into the third consideration. So we talked about the strong man, the rich man. Now we'll talk about the wise man. The wise man is he who learns from all with love. And I mean, you just demonstrated that. I mean, what you exhibited to the sales force is that you're willing to listen to them. And I think that's a big factor here, don't you think? That, this whole idea of wisdom, the wise man learning from all with love. I mean, the big sense here is humility and self-awareness, isn't it?
I mean, definitely. I mean, when I got there, I wanted to learn about the brake business, right, from at Allied Signal. So I asked to go out and talk to, 10 to 15 customers. And they didn't want me to talk to the customers because I was corporate, right? And finally I got through, and there was a big fight, and they let me talk to them. And so I just wrote up a 4-page memo about my observations from these conversations. And I gave it to my boss, who gave it to the CEO. And one day I'm in my boss's office, and the CEO comes walking down the hallway yelling, Randy, Randy. And Randy was my boss. And whenever Steve would do that, everyone would clear out. It was like rats leaving a lit, pastry shop. They would all just scurry because no one wanted to confront him. And I don't blame him. He was a tough guy to deal with. He comes into Randy's office and he says, "Who wrote this?" And he's got the document, right, that I wrote. And Randy doesn't say anything. He just points at me. And then Steve turns to me and says, "You wrote this?" And I said, "Yes." "This is great. How did you get all this information?" And I said, "Steve, I just listened to I just went out and listened to them. I asked them questions, and they answered them, and they realized I was listening. Then they started giving me more information and more information. And now we have a little strategy for the brake business."
Yeah, it's excellent.
I mean, that's kind of an exaggeration, but it's true. I mean, people can be so talented that they're blind to everyone else, and they just want to impose their own vision on everything, and that just makes for a miserable person to work with, and not really an effective person to work with either. But
So I can see, I mean, it's fairly evident, this whole notion of, learning from everybody, whether it be subordinates, whomever. But then we get into this notion of with love. I mean, what's I guess the old Tina Turner song, what's love got to do with it? How does that factor in this business context?
well,
I guess, I mean, a certain element of it is maybe just dignity of persons. I mean, people should know they're appreciated for what they do.
yeah, I mean,
I
I
mean,
think it's hard.
not for what they can do to help us, right?
I mean, there's such a drive toward efficiency, right? I mean, this has been going on for years. I mean, there's just this drivenness to kind of answer the phone in 3 rings instead of 6 rings. It's and Allied was, at the forefront of that, along with General Electric back in the day, about, best practices, continuous improvement, green belts, black belts, Six Sigma, you name it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all driven toward optimization of performing the functions so that you can reduce headcount and lower costs and raise profits. So it's hard to kind of get out of that mindset if you're working for a big company that has a more or less a commodity type product, right? Whether it's McDonald's or any car manufacturing company, once they're up and running and going and so forth. So I think you just have to try to be close to our Lord yourself and take simple interest in the others that you're working with. I mean, this is a kind of interesting anecdote. I don't even know if we should talk about this, but when we were doing our strategic plan at Allied Signal, there was, we hired a temp. My boss hired this temp, um, who was a man, but he was transitioning into being a woman. This is 30 years, even more than 30 years ago, about that 1995, right around then, before, the current, what's going on currently. And so, I just dealt with this person, and she wanted to be called Alicia. And so I dealt with her. I had to deal with her every day during the planning process. And after a while, she realized I just was accepting of her and helping her. And, I had to drive her to the bus stop a few times. And she was so appreciative of all of this. And it became apparent to me that, has anyone ever really been a friend of Alicia? And that you can really help people if you just treat them with dignity and respect and love, ultimately, right? Um, and so it doesn't matter what kind of position they're in. We can't just write people off and say, well, they're too far gone, or they're this or they're that. Everybody can be revitalized, right? Through love. And that's what we're called to do as Christians, is to kind of ignite this charity in other people. But we can only do that if we kind of exercise it ourselves with those people.
That's good.
That's kind of an outlier example, but I think it's a good one, especially now. I mean, I think there wouldn't be so much gender confusion if people, received more attention. And,
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, so you're actually just, we've kind of stumbled into the fourth characteristic here of the honorable man is the one who treats everyone with due dignity, which you're just talking about. And I think, whether it be in a professional environment or in a familial situation, our homes and with our families, we have to let others know that we appreciate their help and their perspective. And I think what that does for them, it reinforces their worth and strengthens their dignity. But I'm wondering, and I'm not suggesting you should have done anything here with Alicia, but I mean, part of honoring others' dignity is being honest with them and correcting when needed. And, within the context of the spirituality of Opus Dei, it's something that we see referenced quite frequently, this whole notion of fraternal correction as a real good. And I don't know, maybe speak to that in the context of, this idea of correcting people is actually a way of treating them with dignity.
yeah, I mean, I think there are all sorts of ways of doing that, right? I mean, to get back to Alicia, I remember one day she came into work, and we were just talking, and she said, "You wouldn't believe what happened to me." And I said, "What?" She said, "Well, I was at the bus stop waiting for the bus to come here, and this man drove by in a pickup truck, and he rolled down his window and he said, there's no way that you're a woman." And then he drove off, and so I didn't say anything to her at that point, or him at that point, but that would have been kind of a gentle opportunity to kind of, hey, well, maybe, do you think he's right, or do you think you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, there are ways to kind of, you don't have to correct people with a lot of, you want to take advantage of an event that happens that opens their eyes a little bit, right? And then reinforce them in a positive way. So if I had met Alicia maybe a couple of years earlier, and he was thinking about doing this, I could have said, "No, you're fine. Just, we got to get to work. Let's get this stuff done."
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's all it takes.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily have to be this big lecture. It can just be a person seeing, okay, yeah, okay, I guess I am in the right spot. I'm in the right lane. Let's keep going. I mean, we told that story, remember, about Barbara Corcoran, I think, on a previous podcast, where, she was one of 11.
The Shark Tank
Yeah.
judge, yeah.
And she was crying when she was a kid, and her mother just looks at her and says, "Look, you're going to find your niche, but right now get the towel and get the dishes done." And she talks about that 50 years later. And she said, that I just took that and I ran with it. And that's all. That's not, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if we look at our own lives, I bet you can identify 3 or 4 instances in your life over the last 40 years. I know I can, where somebody did that to us. And that was enough to kind of get us going in the right way.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we had a late brunch. We're recording this on a Sunday afternoon. I'm going to go do the dishes.
Are you really?
Not Mrs. Corcoran telling me, but Mrs. Buckley's telling me. Yeah. So
Uh-oh.
I want to thank you once again, Mark, for taking the time with us, sharing your interesting experiences and great insight. And thank all of you for joining us and listening to On the Mark.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, take care.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.